This is
Make It Plain.
Make It Plain.
MIP.
With Masamela Matfumo.
Mark Thompson.
Make It Plain.
Get woke.
God bless you. Get woke. Folks, MIP is now COVID-free, meaning free to all subscribers as we navigate this pandemic. We're thinking about everyone, and we've got to get through this together. So for a limited time, no fee to subscribe to Make It Plain on your favorite podcast app. Ladies and gentlemen, a very special guest today. She's a professor of sociology and education at the American University in Washington, D.C., where I used to live. She directs, listen to this, the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, which makes a very cool acronym, PARO, as a matter of fact. And that's in the Center for University Excellence at AU. She's written several books. I'm going to talk about her latest, but other books she's written include The Extreme Gone Mainstream, Commercialization and Far-Right Youth Culture in Germany, and Blood and Culture, Youth Right-Wing Extremism and Belonging in Contemporary Germany. So she knows of which she writes and speaks. Her latest, Hate in the Homeland, the New Global Far Right. Professor Cynthia Miller-Idriss joins us now. Dr. Miller-Idriss, welcome to Make It Plain. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here with us. I want to get right into one of your main points. I know we're going to cover some broad areas, but what I think I found most intriguing, and others do as well, is that COVID has created an opportunity for even more recruitment for the far right wing. Is that accurate?
Yes, it has. I mean, I think one of the saddest things at this moment is that there's so many crises happening at once that we're literally putting out fires, right? I mean, the country has been burning. We have, widespread racial injustice protests. We have election crisis. We have all kinds of, and then a pandemic. So it can be really hard to focus on something like radicalization, which is like a slow, long process that takes more than a year, usually a couple of years from the time that people are exposed to the time that real violence or terrorism occurs. But we have right now perfect conditions. Like I've never seen anything like it for the kinds of conditions that have come together, both the increased propaganda and misinformation, disinformation, recruitment happening, racist and anti-Semitic ideas and, conspiracy theories circulating. And then on the, what we call the demand side, anxiety, isolation, extreme amounts of time spent online, and less contact with other adults, coaches, teachers, people outside the home that might recognize warning signs. So all of those things together create what I call kind of a perfect storm right now that, with some urgency, I think we need to pay attention to if we don't want to see violence a year and a half, 2 years from now. And I know that's a hard ask at a moment when there's a lot going on. It's hard to look ahead, but I think those conditions are very risky.
That far away, a year and a half, 2 years now, a lot of us are feeling like, I was just on the phone with someone earlier today, that there's this feeling that some folk want a civil war right now, and especially with this upcoming election. Like, how are we even going to keep the lid on that?
Yeah, I should say there's also mobilization happening so that's the kind of mobilization I was just talking about. Radicalization is where people enter the kind of like to Charleston, right? The planned violent attacks that targeted people in El Paso, in Charleston, in Christchurch, in Pittsburgh, right? In places like that. But we also, you're absolutely right, have this mobilization going on right now that is to the militia side of the domestic terrorism. And that has its own white supremacist components to it, but is also very anti-government extremist. And, we're having record-breaking sales all summer of ammunition and of weapons and firearms. And so you also see that happening, and calls to, show up in DC, show up at the White House to contest the election. And so, yes, I think everybody I know in this field is concerned about violence around the election, between the election and the inauguration. I would say even that whole period, that's more of what I would call the spontaneous side, where people are showing up heavily armed at protests without necessarily planning violence, but where it's like a tinderbox. There's a lot of risk of spontaneous violence, like we've seen in places like Kenosha and Portland, where people are likely to get hurt. And I think that is also a big risk right now.
But I don't want to minimize what you said. Now I'm hearing it again. Sounds like you're saying that the long-term types of situations that people get pulled into and then organized around, that's something that can manifest over a year and a half, 2 years. But
that's right.
But then there are these spontaneous things that are happening that we're seeing reactions to right now.
Yeah, it's like spontaneous fires, right? And we are really focused on that right now, and I'm putting that out. And I understand we should be, because the risk of violence in spontaneous ways matters a lot too, especially when we have, militia groups mobilizing online, calling for violence, calling for civil war, calling for revolution, all of those kinds of things. But what I mostly am looking at in this book, and my concern right now about youth in particular, is the way they're exposed to kind of a argument that says the solution is a white ethno state, right? And we're going to work toward that, right? Or we're going to deport, right? We want to deport, or voluntarily what they call remigrate, right? They try to use softer language that's like a remigration of ethnic minorities or of people of immigrant background, migrant background, to have to leave the country or remigrate to other parts of it away from the ethno state. And so those kinds of radicalizing ideas, extremist propaganda, and rhetoric that's happening online, it happens slowly. It's a slow process. People get introduced to a meme, to racist ideas, then they gradually over time cross a point of, I don't want to say no return, but where it's much harder to bring somebody back who is radicalized than it is to build off ramps in the beginning. And so that's sort of, what I'm urging people to pay attention to right now is, in the midst of crisis, we still have to look at some of these long-term processes and think about the risks that are happening with, 16-year-olds being online all the time, with recruiters out there trying to persuade them.
And that's really where a lot of this is taking place, isn't it? Online, right? I was sharing with the professor earlier before we got started, folks. For those you haven't seen, I've been watching the Comey Rule on Showtime. A lot of people are also talking about another movie on Netflix, the Social Experiment.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
I'm actually scared to watch that. Okay, yeah. I'm working my. Have you seen it yet?
I haven't seen it yet, but I have heard about it too.
Oh.
Yes, yeah.
But yeah. I'm sure it's going to complement your thesis, because someone already told me that even if let's not even get into the extremism yet, that we all, and especially young people, a lot of us getting like this too, getting older, cannot put this phone down.
Right. Yeah.
And it's like we even just having a conversation and then we have to go back to the phone. Yeah. So we're more and more susceptible because of that addiction to what's going on online, isn't it?
Yeah, you have this addiction, then you combine that with really the generation that are digital natives who are just growing up in that space, right? Where they've always been a part of it. That's how they communicate. And I would say the way I describe it is the online ecosystem underpins the whole thing, right? It creates communication channels for them. It creates, it has weaponized youth culture through these kind of memes and iconography and the way in which those evolve and mobilize and share extremist and racist and anti-Semitic Islamophobic content, for example. and it also helps them organize financially, get, sell stuff, but also get donations, raise money to undertake action. But I think it's important to, to remember that the online has to connect to the offline at some point when they actually go mobilize in marches or down in Charlottesville or plan violence. They're still looking at offline places. And so it's not, offline places still matter. They meet people in mixed martial arts gyms I talk about, or they, on college campuses when they're hosting so-called provocative speakers, right? So these speakers that kind of get hosted by groups, but then are sharing kind of extremist content as well. They hang up paper flyers around campuses that share white supremacist propaganda and direct young people to find a URL so then they can go online. So there's a connection between the offline and the online world that I think matters a lot. It's not like this is just kids sitting in a dark corner of their bedroom online all the time and then they fall down a rabbit hole and become extremists. They are making choices. They're still going out in the world, coming back to their computer. They're on their phones. They encounter something out there in the world that they look up. They run a search that takes them to a white supremacist site, right? That's what happened with Dylan Roof, right? He ran a search for something and then the first hit was a white supremacist site. And he says in his interviews, he's never been the same since that day, right? So those algorithms, how the search engines work, how the recommendation features work, also start to drive people toward content that they then see the world in a different way when they're off their computers. So it's this balance of things.
We've heard a lot the term boogaloo. Is that the lead actor in what's taking place right now in terms of online recruitment in the moment of this pandemic?
Yeah, I think the Boogaloo is not I wouldn't say they're the most important actor, but they're the perfect example of what I was just talking about how online youth culture can influence offline violence. It's probably the best example we have, which is, it started as a joke, an internet joke among teenagers who were making fun of a movie, a 1984 breakdancing movie that was too similar to the original. And so they used it as a term to refer to a coming civil war, a second civil war, referencing that original, it'll be the Boogaloo, like something that is the second after a first. But then it became through a series of memes online, became renamed the Big Igloo. It sounded like Boogaloo, and Big Luau, which encouraged them then to wear these Hawaiian shirts, because it also referenced a pig roast, which is, a slur against law enforcement. So it's a threat as well. And then next thing you know, these guys are showing up, middle-aged guys, not the teenagers who were, there's some youth there too, but not the people who created the original meme. They inspired hundreds of people to join these groups, and then dozens of them at least to show up and protest, heavily armed, at state capitals to protest Second Amendment rights in Richmond, and then shelter-in-place orders in the state capitals in April, and then finally at the George Floyd protests to either incite violence or in at least one case to march side by side, against white supremacists. And that's what gets a little confusing too, is they don't ideologically, what unites them is a sense of threat and anti-government revolutionary calls. Some of them inspire white supremacists, but others argue that they are not, part of the white supremacist fringe at all.
Yeah, that's interesting. So $1 million question. Mm-hmm. Where's Trump in all of this? What role does he play? Is he a rallying point? Is he a direct instigator, or is he indirect? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think the first thing that's important to know is that, I think it's easy from the outside too, I think, to point to Trump as an individual and say, what's happened, right? And it has happened around the mobilization and the extreme mainstreaming of extremist ideology, I think, has happened under his watch. And there's no doubt that the kinds of things that he says has legitimized and helped to normalize and even mainstream far-right extremist ideas, I think. But I also think it's important to note that hate groups were rising before this election. He, in many ways, is a symptom rather than the cause of this. And I think it's when we point to only one person or an administration, it's easy to write off everybody else, who contributed to the problem. And so I think we have to hold elected officials accountable for their words and to remember that those words matter. Research shows that the words that elected officials use about immigrants, for example, matter for whether people become violent against immigrants on the extremist fringe. So when elected officials use words that celebrate, immigrants as contributing to the vitality of a nation, there's less violence. When they use incendiary language, violence goes up. So we know that those words matter and they should be held accountable for words. But it's not the only problem. And I think it's not like solving that is going to solve where we are, right? There's a whole lot of things coinciding. But in terms of mainstreaming normalization, they're definitely, at least in the beginning, I think by extremist groups, this administration was seen as legitimizing a lot of those ideas.
Yeah, but you're right. The extremist groups, you mentioned Dylan Roof, this was in the Obama administration.
Right.
And we saw the backlash against him and being an African-American president, and as I've talked to people, it's interesting. Obama's gone. Mm-hmm. You remember the argument with Obama was he's coming to get our guns. Right. And so Trump clearly isn't, but this movement has not subsided. So you're right. It doesn't really matter. You change out the president. I'm not convinced if you're mobilizing around the guy you think is coming to get your guns, and the guy comes in and says he's not coming to get your guns, and then the gun sales go up anyway.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's also really important to note that it's global, right? So we had that terrible, terrorist attack in Oslo, a terrible terrorist attack, a white supremacist attack in Christchurch, that these guys are circulating the same conspiracy about the idea of a great replacement. They're circulating the idea that there's an orchestrated effort on the part of Jews or Muslims to replace white societies with multicultural ones through immigration and demographic change, and that's like an existential threat that they have to heroically thwart and fight against. And that's the same conspiracy that motivates these terrorist fringe groups wherever they are. So it shows up differently. Here you'll hear sometimes in the States people call it, on the extreme fringe, refer to it as white genocide. In Europe, they'll refer to it as something called Eurabia, like Europe is going to turn Arab. But basically, they're unified under the same conspirational idea that is motivated by a sense of extreme threat. And they motivate and inspire even each other. They live stream the attacks. Some of them in Germany, the last two terrorist attacks in Germany at a synagogue and at a shishi bar, hookah bar, they live streamed or wrote their manifestos in English, right? These were performances for a global community, not just, a national one where you would be writing in German or speaking in German. So I think that's also important. It's not just about one politician or one administration, but we have to see it as something more systemic and deeper and has to be addressed on a much deeper level.
Obviously, young men are more susceptible than young women. But let me not make a generalization. Are women being recruited into this?
They are. And in fact, women's roles are increasing. So that is important to note that across the board, both on the, extremist fringe, on the terrorist fringe, we've seen women, brought up for trial now, actually charged with terror offenses. We have women more engaged on that level of things, even in the violence. But they are also involved in the kind of what we call the softer side of recruitment, often through now YouTube videos that are almost like, influencer kinds of videos that are embedded in like homemaking or, homeschooling, homesteading, gardening, like a lot of lifestyle types of things that infuse ideology about reframing feminism around choice and around being, a good wife and homemaker, but also celebrating like European heritage in the part of that. So it's this ideologies that then draw women into the movement through a kind of sneaky backdoor that has been drawing more women into the movement. But that said, this is really the violence which is mostly what I'm concerned with, is prevention of violence, is the domain of men, and mostly young men. And so there's a lot to be said about why that's the case. I think a lot of it has to do with these the narratives in that bigger conspiracy theory around defense and threat, and calling on people to act heroically to protect your people or your nation, and why that is that young men are attracted to that, to wanting, they describe it as a sense of purpose or belonging or meaning in their lives, and why it is that we as society are somehow not offering that, or what is missing that makes them vulnerable in that way. Again, back to the isolation and lack of belonging that we have right now, creating high risk factors under COVID-19 for them to be drawn into something that offers them what they think actually is a moral act. I mean, that's the part that's really hard to wrap your head around. But when you read these manifestos, when you read what people are saying, the way they live stream, they actually believe they are doing the right thing. Some of them, they're not, they believe this is the moral engagement to be heroic and save their people, or else they're going to end up like, they'll use Native American, actually even metaphors, and say, we don't want to end up like Native Americans on a reservation, right? Like there's that kind of threat, which, it sounds so illogical, but that's how radicalization works. You get further and further down that pathway. And once you get into that place, you start interpreting every fact or demographic fact about birth rates or anything through that lens, and through a threat lens. And then young men in particular seem drawn to this call to act heroically. That's the same with ISIS, these calls to restore the caliphate, to engage heroically, to, resist the West. I mean, it's the same playbook that recruiters use, and kind of groom these young men into believing that they're doing the heroic thing.
The shooter in Kenosha, would he fall into this category?
Yeah, I think the shooter in Kenosha is an interesting case because, he responded, also believed it's not an organized extremist group, but these were vigilante groups who are, armed citizen groups making a call over social media for people to come and defend a community, to defend law enforcement, and to act heroically. So he responded in the same way. Now that call and calls like that, I think it's really important, are also, dog whistle racism that is drawing on, by referring to protect the city from, I think the language was like evil thugs or something like that.
Right. That was it. Yeah.
Right. You have to look at the language and understand that there's a lot going on there that is that is more than just call to support law enforcement. But, that said, I think it is the same kind of motivation. It's completely predictable when you have a young man who clearly was drawn to, and a lot of these, terrorist actors have been either drawn to the military, applied to law enforcement jobs, work in security guards, there are all kinds of patterns about, why someone might be drawn to those kinds of roles, either got rejected, involuntary dismissal from the military, right, are out of it, weren't able to make it into. So you see people whose roles were then in security or extreme fitness, working out, really getting extraordinarily kind of hyper masculine in their musculature, all of that kind of somehow factoring into some of these situations. And I think, yes, Kenosha was in that sense similar, although it was a spontaneous, it was not the kind of longer radicalization that I'm talking about, but an example of this spontaneous call to action and how that can lead to terrible violence.
What can we do about it?
Yeah.
Professor, I mean, it's happening right under our noses.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the kind of emergency response, I think, is, I run this research lab that you mentioned. So the first thing we did under the pandemic is partnered with the Southern Poverty Law Center, and we created a guide for parents and caregivers, which people can get at www.american.edu/peril, PERIL. It's right there. It's free. It's sort of 18 pages to kind of educate parents and caregivers who now are, in many cases, the only adults, communicating with young people, what are the warning signs? What are some risk factors? Starting to better recognize that, and also understand how to build resistance to those narratives. How do you strengthen resilience and some of the more positive kind of ways to make sure that kids aren't feeling as out of control or as vulnerable to those narratives to act heroically, let's say. So that's one thing, is education. We're working now to expand that to guides from mental health counselors, to coaches, to teachers, principals. So in the short term, I think a lot of awareness of adults who can keep an eye on young people and understand when they see those warning flags, what they are. So if you see a kid, saying, making a joke about the Holocaust as they put a pizza in the oven, which is a horrific meme that circulates online. And someone I know had heard a kid say that as they put it in the that they've seen something online, right? They've encountered something online, and that's what that is. And that they're exposed, and that it's time for a conversation. And here's some tips on how to have those conversations. If a teacher sees, one of the things that teachers are now receiving training on, unfortunately, is how to recognize signs of child abuse when they're teaching online, because reports have gone way down of child abuse under the pandemic because teachers are a major reporter. And so we are trying to figure out, are there ways that we can teach teachers to better recognize signs, of, something they might not notice, an emoji or a turn of phrase or a speech or a joke that somebody makes, that if you know what you're tuned into, you would recognize that as, hey, this is somebody who's been exposed. So a lot of what we're working on right now is like emergency stopgap, trying to get people to recognize. But in the long term, I think, as I suggest in the book, thinking more broadly about the places and spaces where people encounter these messages from the beginning. So we spend a lot of time talking about, how do terrorist groups, recruit and organize, and why people cognitively are attracted to extremist groups, like the things I talked about, the emotional vulnerabilities. But we haven't spent enough time asking where they encounter those messages. And if we look at the question of where, you start to see a whole range of spaces and places, like those cooking shows I talked about, or the mixed martial arts and combat sports, where there's festivals, or college campuses where they're going to see that propaganda for the first time on a flyer, and then you start to think, who's already in that space that I can work with, and design some interventions to make them more aware. So that's the approach our lab is taking, is sort of pre-prevention.
Yeah. This is amazing work that you're doing. Are the social media companies themselves, do they have any responsibility? Of course they do, but are they taking responsibility at all? Taking more? Do you think that they be? Excuse
They
me.
should, yeah. This is a great question, and I think they care about it, I would say, for the most part, but should be doing a lot more. To be fair to the major social media companies, one of the huge problems is that the game playing and the codes change so rapidly that anything that is an attempt to ban just backfires, right? I think it drives them further along. So, you have Boogaloo, you ban the word Boogaloo, and then they just use Big Igloo, and then you ban that word, and then they started using other like codes. The story I've often told in Germany, where, I spent the first couple decades of my career, because it was the best place to study school-based responses to hate, before it became so much more relevant here. There they were banning, one of the schools banned the number 88 from display, because 88 is a code for Heil Hitler. It's the eighth letter of the alphabet, 88, for HH. And so kids started wearing t-shirts that said 100 minus 12 or 87 plus 1, right? Like, they will creatively, if you ban a kid from doing something, they will immediately find a way around it. It's part of what's fun for them, and it makes it a game playing. So I think, I think the social media companies are in a tough spot in that sense. What we need, a much deeper level understanding at earlier stages, both for, about how the algorithms work and how stuff shows up in people's feeds, how that factors into extremist content exposure and radicalization, but also how can we better inform, and somebody was just telling me in another meeting, like, there's hardly anything you can do in life that you don't have to watch, like or read a manual or a video. But why is it that if you just sign up for, a Twitter account or a Facebook account, you don't have to watch something that tells you like how this works, right? So we need to have some kind of way of educating people about what misinformation looks like, what propaganda looks like, how people try to persuade you, that something is false. And we have, some of us, as you get older, you start to recognize like the scams that come across your email screen, and not to click on this, but it's very hard for people to recognize, bots, fake accounts, things actually through artificial intelligence trying to polarize us as a community. And there's a great quiz out right now from Clemson University that lets you take the quiz. It's 8 different social media accounts, and you have to identify which one's a bot. And look, I mean, I am supposed to be kind of an expert on this, and I took the quiz and got 5 out of 8. Didn't recognize, and it's half of them are real people and half of them are bots. And you read through their social media posts, and you're trying to tell, which ones are real and which ones are fake. And it's very difficult to tell. So I think most Americans, most people in the world don't even understand that a lot of what they might see on their feed is not even from a real person. It's from a deliberate attempt to polarize you and to persuade you to believe in something more extreme than you might otherwise. And so, that kind of, it's the social media companies could invest, for example, in work that would try to prevent people and inoculate them against that kind of engagement or susceptibility, help educate them in a better way. But I think the approach of just banning, unfortunately, is just, it just keeps the whole thing going in terms of how young people respond to those, attempts to you make drinking illegal. We get binge drinking until people turn 21, right? It just really a good way to prevent young people from doing something.
No, I agree. And it's interesting because you look at Trump, he wants to ban TikTok because TikTok organized against him. Right. But he will not condemn the behavior you're talking about.
Right. Yeah. And the sources of the misinformation, the potential for foreign interference, what it is that, whose benefit is it to have this kind of disruption, right? And how are we all really pawns in it? And that starts to sound kind of conspirational, right? But I think each one of us has to, that's the polarization side of the work we do, to start to really think about how can we be less susceptible ourselves to these polarizing moments in ways that might, help us move forward as a community, as a country in better ways. But it's, we lack really the kind of basic education that help people understand how to detect what they're seeing, why it is that they might encounter scapegoating and blame the virus, on a lab, right? That it was created in a lab, and someone's presenting you information about the fact that the virus is, manufactured. And people start to believe that, right? They start to believe that a vaccine is going to have a tracker in it. I mean, this is all kind of extremist propaganda that circulates that really then has a real impact on whether people will get the vaccine or whether people think the virus is a real thing, for example. And so those kinds of, it's not just extremist propaganda about white supremacy or domestic extremism or there's also health misinformation and all kinds of things that circulate in this way.
I have often felt that, and you're right, it doesn't have to be the hate and the violence, but when you put so much disinformation in the atmosphere, it makes it difficult for even the average person to discern, maybe we shouldn't have a vaccine, and you make people paranoid about that. And you really don't have a counter argument because there's so much it's almost like someone decided we're going to keep people as disinformed, as confused as possible, so they literally can't tell fact from fiction, conspiracy theories. And there may be some bad things going on, but when you when you over conspiratize everything, then you can't even discern the real conspiracy from conspiracy.
Well, and that's, conspiracies brings up the issue of, QAnon and the rapid growth of sweeping conspiracy theories. I mean, one of the things that's happened to me, I spent a lot of time in my last few years in particular responding to questions like yours about how can we help, what could parents do, what could teachers do. Just in the last few weeks, I started getting questions about what can we tell teenagers whose parents are radicalizing into QAnon, right? A totally heartbreaking question. How can we advise teenagers who are facing this? And so I think that marks a real shift, right? For us, if you see that I used to think of youth as the most vulnerable, but middle-aged, regular middle-aged folks are somehow convinced and have become convinced that there's a, international child trafficking ring. I mean, it's, you look at the actual conspiracy theory and you think they can't. How could someone believe this? But again, these pandemic conditions create tremendous uncertainty. It's a dangerous world, a virus they can't see. And then you have elected officials out there who aren't condemning it. And that's, even the refusal to condemn. And I think when people are having trouble separating fact from fiction, that's where leadership really can be helpful in just stabilizing, what is true, what isn't true, what's real, what's not real. And that's where social media is also very challenging because the quality of the bots has improved. The videos and what they call deep fakes is improving, which makes it harder and harder for ordinary people to really tell the difference between, fake information and real information.
And now you call out some bots, and then the bots actually respond and say, we're not bots.
Right, exactly, right. And they seem right. I mean, like I said, I was fooled, and I think that's I admit that, and I'm public about that because I think it's a really humbling thing to say, look, even if people who, study this stuff, I took it quickly, but I took it quickly thinking this is a really interesting tool. Let me see how it works. Maybe we can, promote this. And then I got 5 out of 8. And I thought, wow, I mean, they've gotten much better, these accounts. And so that is a major factor, I think, in how we think about, it's not the only thing going on, but it's a part of what's so unsettling right now is they might be having a whole engagement with a totally a non-existent person online that's driving them further to extreme opinions.
Yeah. Folks, this is very important. We all are, to some extent, aware of it. But what Dr. Miller-Idriss has done is really chronicle the impact of this, how widespread this is. This is global. And we've got to address it. We've got to acknowledge it. First of all, cannot be in denial about this. And then we've got to figure out ways to address it. Let me just answer so quickly before we go. So this is global. Mm-hmm. Are we picking up any traffic of global calls and conversations about the need for some type of mass reaction in the United States or some type of overthrow and people need to get in the streets? Are we seeing anything like that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are different ways in which what's happening in the U.S. goes global, and then what's happening globally affects the U.S. on the domestic extremist side, right? So on the one hand, you have the global white supremacist extremists who do make up the majority of what we call domestic extremists. I mean, you do have, in addition to the white supremacist extremists, you have like seditionists and these militia groups that are anti-government extremist and some single issue extremists like anti-abortion extremists who attack abortion clinics, that kind of thing. So it's a spectrum, but white supremacist extremists make up the majority of them, and they are exporting their ideology, globally on the one hand, inspiring, I hate to use that word, but it is what happens. So you had Timothy McVeigh in 1995 kill 168 people in Oklahoma City, and that he's considered a saint basically globally. They use soccer scores on a t-shirt I've seen, it says 168:1 McVeigh versus U.S. government, because the U.S. government executed him. And the idea is, we got 168, you got one. So that, you have German neo-Nazis in that example of the t-shirt that I've seen claiming ownership over a horrific terrorist attack in the U.S. So they claim ownership over it. They celebrate. They call each other saints and disciples. They have a whole global network of the way that this works. But the anti-government extremism is also, in an odd way, spreading. And so you have, in Germany now, you have sovereign citizen movements, you have QAnon, spreading at protests. You have similar kinds of phenomena. QAnon, I read recently, is in 75 countries. It is not just an American incident, but it's, clearly has resonance globally. And we see that also with other populist leaders in Brazil and India, where you have, you might have anti-Muslim violence or other kinds of, ethnic, racial group and in-group tensions happening that are nationalistic as well. So there's a lot going on. It's a big mix of factors, but definitely I think it's really important. That's why I wanted the word global, in the subtitle of this book, because I think it's really important to remember it's just a U.S. based phenomenon, even if this is a book primarily about the U.S.
Yeah. Hate in the Homeland, the New Global Far Right by Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss. You all should check this out. Be informed, be aware. There's a lot to learn here and a lot to address. We all must. Again, we can't address it if we're not aware. Dr. Miller-Idriss, thank you so much for joining us on Make It Plain.
Thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Thank you.
God, you are our refuge. Send our ancestors to guard our doors. Cast out this virus from our communities and our bodies. Heal, bless, and protect everyone listening and their loved ones. Thank you for listening to Make It Plain and Get Woke. Remember to listen, like, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. If all minds are clear, it has been made plain.